You think feeding a family on almost nothing required magic or miracles? Think again. Appalachian families and rural southern homesteads perfected money-saving tricks that could stretch a dollar further than city folks ever imagined possible. Let's dig into 30 genius hillbilly tricks that can feed your family for $20 a week. Stretching ground meat with oatmeal was one of the oldest and most effective tricks passed down through generations of mountain families who understood that a pound of beef could become two with the right technique. Women would mix a cup of raw oatmeal into every pound of ground meat, adding an egg to bind everything together and seasonings to mask the grain. The oatmeal absorbed the meat juices during cooking, swelling into something that tasted remarkably close to pure beef while doubling the volume. This wasn't just about saving money, though a pound of oatmeal cost pennies compared to another pound of meat. The oatmeal actually improved the texture, keeping meatloaves moist and meatballs tender in ways that pure beef couldn't match. Families used this trick for everything from hamburger patties to chili to spaghetti sauce, feeding 8 mouths on what should have fed 4. The children never knew the difference, and parents smiled knowing their grocery budget stretched twice as far. Keeping a perpetual soup pot on the back of the wood stove was standard practice in mountain kitchens where nothing edible ever went to waste and every scrap found purpose. The pot stayed warm throughout the day, receiving vegetable trimmings, meat scraps, bones, leftover rice, pasta water, and anything else that still held nutrition. Each addition changed the flavor slightly, meaning no 2 bowls ever tasted exactly the same. Yet the soup remained consistently hearty and satisfying. Families ladled out portions for lunch or supper, then added water and new scraps to keep the cycle going for weeks at a time. The constant simmering extracted every vitamin and mineral from ingredients that would otherwise become garbage. This single pot could provide the base for countless meals, stretching resources beyond what seemed possible. Children grew up thinking soup was supposed to taste different every day, never realizing they were eating what modern folks might call kitchen waste, transformed into genuine nourishment. Making flour gravy to stretch meals was the secret weapon of every mountain grandmother who understood that a few tablespoons of flour and some drippings could turn a small portion into a feast. After frying meat, the cook would sprinkle flour into the hot grease, stirring until it browned before slowly adding milk or water to create thick, rich gravy. This gravy covered biscuits, potatoes, rice, or bread, transforming carbohydrates into something that tasted like a complete meal with protein richness. The technique required skill and practice to avoid lumps, but once mastered, it became instinctive. A single pork chop could feed a family of 6 when sliced thin and smothered in gravy over a mountain of biscuits. The gravy absorbed the meat flavor, spreading it across every bite of starch. Families called it making something from nothing, though really it was making everything from something small and treating nothing as expendable. Saving bacon grease in a jar by the stove was more than habit. It was economic survival that turned cooking byproduct into culinary gold worth more than its weight in store-bought shortening. Every strip of bacon rendered fat that was carefully strained through cheesecloth into a dedicated container, kept at room temperature for easy access during cooking. This grease-seasoned cast-iron skillets, fried eggs, flavored beans, greased biscuit pans, and added depth to any dish that needed richness. Mountain families understood that bacon grease carried concentrated pork flavor that expensive seasonings couldn't match. A jar might last weeks, providing free cooking fat that would otherwise cost precious grocery money. The practice was so universal that children assumed every kitchen had a grease jar until they visited city relatives who threw their drippings away. That small jar represented the difference between bland poverty food and meals that tasted like abundance. Buying day-old bread from bakeries at half price or less was a weekly ritual that smart rural families never missed when trips to town allowed shopping opportunities. Bakeries and grocery stores marked down yesterday's loaves to clear shelf space, offering perfectly good bread at fractions of the original cost. Mountain wives arrived early, knowing the best selection went fast to families who understood this simple trick. The bread worked perfectly for toast, sandwiches, breadcrumbs, bread pudding, stuffing, and French toast, where freshness mattered less than price. Some families bought enough day-old bread to last the week, storing loaves in cool pantries or even freezing them when electricity reached the hollows. Children ate sandwiches made from bread that cost pennies per loaf, never tasting any difference from the expensive fresh version. This single habit could cut bread expenses by 60% or more, freeing money for protein and vegetables. Growing windowsill herbs year-round provided fresh seasoning that transformed bland budget meals into something restaurant kitchens would envy without spending a cent on expensive dried herbs from stores. Women kept small pots of parsley, chives, thyme, and green onions growing in sunny windows throughout winter, snipping what they needed and letting the plants regrow continuously. These fresh herbs added brightness and complexity to soups, stews, eggs, and beans that dried versions couldn't match. Starting herbs from seed cost almost nothing, and once established, the plants produced indefinitely with basic water and sunlight. Mountain families understood that flavor was the difference between food you tolerated and food you anticipated, and fresh herbs provided flavor without cost. Children learned to recognize these plants and help tend them, understanding from young ages that food could come from the windowsill as easily as the store. A few pots of herbs represented independence from grocery store prices and seasons. Using chicken backs and necks for rich stock was how mountain families extracted maximum value from poultry that city folks considered barely worth buying at rock-bottom prices per pound. These bony cuts contained collagen, marrow, and meat scraps that simmered into deeply flavorful broth perfect for soups, gravies, rice dishes, and cooking beans. A pound of backs and necks cost a fraction of breast meat, but provided the foundation for multiple meals stretching across the week. Women would simmer the bones for hours with onion, celery scraps, and peppercorns until the broth turned golden and rich. After straining, they picked every shred of meat from the bones, nothing wasted, adding it back to soups or serving it over rice. This stock became the base liquid for cooking grains, making them taste like they'd been prepared with expensive ingredients. The practice taught families that the cheapest cuts often held the most potential for those patient enough to extract it. Foraging wild greens in spring provided free vegetables packed with vitamins that mountain families needed after long winters, surviving on stored food and preserved meats. Women and children walked fields and forest edges gathering dandelion greens, poke salad, lamb's quarters, and wild onions that grew abundantly without any cultivation or cost. These greens required knowledge to identify safely, but that knowledge passed through generations until gathering became instinctive. Properly prepared, wild greens tasted as good or better than store-bought vegetables, with deeper mineral complexity from growing in rich forest soil. Some families gathered enough to can or dry for later, extending free food into seasons when nothing grew. The practice connected people to land in ways grocery shopping never could, teaching children that food existed everywhere if you knew how to find it. Spring foraging trips became family traditions, mixing nutrition gathering with outdoor time and generational knowledge transfer. Making buttermilk from regular milk stretched dairy budgets while providing essential ingredient for the fluffiest biscuits and most tender fried chicken that mountain cooking demanded. The process was simple: adding a tablespoon of vinegar or lemon juice to regular milk and letting it sit until thickened and slightly curdled, usually about 10 minutes. This homemade buttermilk worked perfectly in any recipe calling for the real thing at a fraction of the cost, since regular milk was always cheaper than cultured buttermilk. Families used this trick for pancakes, cornbread, cakes, and marinades, never needing to buy expensive specialty dairy products. The acid tenderized baked goods and meats alike, creating results that matched or exceeded recipes using store-bought buttermilk. Children watched mothers perform this kitchen alchemy, learning that substitutes often worked as well as the real thing when you understood the science behind cooking. This knowledge saved dollars monthly while losing nothing in quality. Rendering lard from pork fat scraps provided free cooking fat superior to anything stores sold, while ensuring nothing from butchered hogs went unused in households where waste was considered sinful. When families butchered pigs or received fat trimmings from neighbors, The fat was cut into small pieces and slowly heated in large pots until it melted into clear liquid. This liquid was strained through cloth and cooled into pure white lard that stored for months without refrigeration when kept in cool places. The lard made flakier pie crusts than butter, crispier fried foods than vegetable oil, and spread on bread like the richest cream. Families who rendered their own lard never bought shortening from stores, saving significant money annually while producing superior results. The cracklins left after rendering became snacks or cornbread additions, meaning even the rendering process created bonus food. This self-sufficiency represented mountain values perfectly. Work hard, waste nothing, and produce results better than money could buy. Drying beans and peas from the garden for winter storage meant families could grow their own protein that lasted indefinitely without refrigeration or expensive canning equipment. Women let bean pods dry on the vine until they rattled, then shelled them into cloth sacks hung in dry attics where air circulated freely. These dried legumes stored for years when kept away from moisture and pests, providing reliable protein regardless of grocery store access or prices. A single row of bean plants could produce pounds of dried beans, enough to feed a family through winter months. The varieties passed through generations, with each family maintaining seeds adapted to their specific soil and climate. Children helped with shelling, learning patience while contributing meaningfully to family survival. Dried beans cost nothing beyond seed and labor, representing the purest form of food independence that mountain families valued above almost everything else. Canning everything possible during harvest season transformed summer abundance into year-round food security that freed families from winter grocery dependence entirely. Women worked marathon sessions over boiling water bath canners and pressure cookers, putting up tomatoes, green beans, corn, pickles, jams, and anything else the garden produced. The investment in jars and lids paid dividends for decades as containers cycled through endless seasons of filling, eating, and refilling. A well-stocked cellar held hundreds of jars representing thousands of meals that required no additional grocery spending. Families counted their preserved food like savings accounts, knowing exactly how many weeks of eating lined those shelves. Children grew up understanding the connection between summer labor and winter security in ways that store-bought food could never teach. This practice meant grocery lists stayed short, even when money ran shorter. Raising backyard chickens for eggs provided daily protein that cost almost nothing once the initial flock was established and self-sustaining through natural reproduction. Hens ate kitchen scraps, garden waste, insects, and minimal purchased feed while producing eggs that would cost significant money at stores. A small flock of 6 hens could provide more than enough eggs for a family, with surplus to barter with neighbors for other goods. The chickens themselves eventually became soup when egg production declined, meaning nothing was wasted in the cycle. Children gathered eggs as morning chores, learning responsibility while literally collecting breakfast. The birds required minimal space and equipment, making them accessible even for families with small properties. Backyard eggs tasted richer than store versions, with deep orange yolks that spoke to the varied diet the birds enjoyed. This single practice could eliminate one of the largest recurring grocery expenses entirely. Making cheese from extra milk turned surplus dairy into preserved protein that stored for months and added richness to meals that plain milk couldn't provide. When cows or goats produced more than families could drink, the excess became farmers' cheese through simple heating, acid addition, and straining. The process required no special equipment beyond cheesecloth and patience, producing fresh cheese within hours of starting. This cheese crumbled over beans, melted into casseroles, spread on bread, and added protein to vegetable dishes. The whey byproduct fed pigs or chickens, meaning nothing from the milk was lost. Families who mastered cheese-making never worried about milk spoiling before it could be consumed. Some progressed to aged cheeses that stored even longer, creating variety without additional cost. The skill transformed a liability into an asset, proving again that mountain ingenuity could solve problems that money couldn't. Bartering surplus garden produce with neighbors multiplied food variety without spending any money and strengthened community bonds that provided security beyond economics. A family with excess tomatoes could trade with neighbors growing surplus squash, both ending up with more variety than either could produce alone. These informal exchange networks operated on trust and reciprocity, with families tracking favors across seasons and years. The practice encouraged specialization, with some families focusing on crops they grew best, knowing they could trade for what they lacked. Children learned negotiation and fairness through watching these exchanges, understanding that community relationships held real economic value. Bartering extended beyond produce to include eggs, preserved goods, skills, and labor, creating resilient networks that survived when cash economies struggled. The practice meant grocery stores became supplementary rather than essential, with most food coming from gardens and neighbors. Planting a fall garden for winter greens extended the growing season and provided fresh vegetables when most families relied entirely on preserved foods and whatever stores offered. Collards, kale, turnips, and winter lettuce actually improved with light frost, becoming sweeter as cold converted their starches to sugars. These hardy greens survived well into winter under simple cold frames or even just mulch protection in milder areas. A fall garden required minimal effort since cooler weather meant less watering and fewer pest problems than summer growing. Families who planted in late summer harvested fresh greens through Thanksgiving and beyond, adding nutrition and variety to winter diets. The practice cost nothing beyond seeds and contradicted the assumption that gardening ended with first frost. Children saw that food production could happen year-round with planning and knowledge. Fresh winter greens tasted like small miracles after months of canned and dried provisions. Catching and preserving fish from local streams and ponds provided free protein that required only time, basic equipment, and knowledge of where fish lived and what they ate. Mountain families knew their local waters intimately, understanding seasonal patterns that made catching easier during spawning runs or feeding times. Caught fish were eaten fresh, smoked, salted, or canned depending on quantity and preservation resources available. A successful fishing trip could provide protein for weeks when properly preserved, costing nothing but the labor of catching and processing. Children learned to fish young, gaining skills that would feed them throughout their lives regardless of economic circumstances. The practice connected families to waterways in their communities, building knowledge passed through generations. Fish represented truly free food for those willing to invest time instead of money, a trade mountain families made gladly. Making apple butter from windfall fruit transformed free-fallen apples that would otherwise rot into preserved sweetness that lasted through winter and spread across countless breakfasts. Families gathered apples that dropped naturally or were knocked down by storms. Fruit, too bruised for fresh eating but perfectly good for cooking. These apples were quartered, cooked down with water until soft, then strained and simmered for hours with sugar and spices until thick and dark. The slow cooking required attention and stirring, but no special skills or equipment beyond a large pot and wooden spoon. Sealed in jars, apple butter kept for years and provided natural sweetness for biscuits, toast, pancakes, and oatmeal. Children helped gather apples and stir the pot, learning patience while the kitchen filled with cinnamon fragrance. This practice turned potential waste into valuable preserved food that would cost significant money at any store. Buying staples in bulk during sales reduced per-unit costs dramatically and ensured families never ran out of basics regardless of when the next paycheck arrived or sale occurred. Smart shoppers watched advertisements and stocked up on flour, sugar, cornmeal, and rice when prices dropped, buying months of supply at once. This required storage space and initial capital, but paid dividends through consistent savings that compounded over time. Families with well-stocked pantries never paid full price for staples because they could wait for sales rather than buying from necessity. The practice smoothed out price fluctuations and provided security against hard times when any grocery money became precious. Children grew up in homes where abundant pantry shelves represented not wealth, but wisdom and planning. Buying bulk during sales could reduce staple costs by 30% or more annually, savings that added up to meaningful money over years. Cooking dried beans from scratch instead of buying canned versions saved enormous money while producing superior results that no factory processing could match. A pound of dried beans costing under $1 produced the equivalent of 4 or 5 cans, which would cost several dollars at store prices. The beans required soaking and longer cooking times, but rewarded patience with creamier texture and better flavor absorption. Families cooked large batches on weekends, portioning for meals throughout the week or freezing for later use. The cooking liquid itself became flavorful broth for soups and gravies, meaning dried beans produced more usable food than their canned equivalents. Children who grew up eating properly cooked dried beans often found canned versions disappointing by comparison. This single substitution could save families hundreds of dollars annually while actually improving meal quality, the rare budget trick that sacrificed nothing. Making cornbread from scratch cost pennies compared to store-bought bread and provided the perfect vehicle for soaking up bean juice, gravy, and soup broth that contained nutrition too valuable to leave in bowls. Cornmeal was cheap and stored indefinitely, requiring only buttermilk, egg, and a little fat to become golden bread that emerged from cast-iron skillets with crispy edges and tender centers. A single batch cost less than a dime to produce, yet fed an entire family alongside whatever main dish graced the table. The bread's slightly sweet corn flavor complemented savory dishes perfectly, while providing filling carbohydrates that stretched meals further. Families baked cornbread almost daily, its production becoming so routine that measurements were unnecessary. Children grew up crumbling cornbread into milk or buttermilk for simple suppers that cost almost nothing yet satisfied completely. This staple represented mountain cooking at its purest. Cheap ingredients transformed through skill into something genuinely delicious. Gleaning fields after commercial harvest provided free produce that farmers left behind because picking wasn't worth their labor costs, but was certainly worth family effort. After crops were commercially harvested, families walked fields gathering potatoes, corn, beans, and other vegetables that mechanical harvesters missed or damaged. Farmers generally welcomed gleaners who cleaned their fields while getting free food, creating relationships that benefited everyone involved. A day of gleaning could yield bushels of produce that would cost significant money at stores, all free for the labor of bending and gathering. Children participated alongside adults, learning that food existed beyond grocery stores for those willing to work. The practice taught humility and gratitude while filling pantries and root cellars with provisions. Gleaning connected families to agricultural cycles and farming neighbors in ways that buying at stores never could, building community while building food security. Stretching coffee with chicory root made expensive imported beans last twice as long, while adding an earthy depth that many families came to prefer over straight coffee. Chicory roots were dug, roasted until dark, and ground to mix with regular coffee at ratios that stretched the precious beans. The practice originated from necessity during times when coffee was scarce or unaffordable, but continued because many genuinely liked the flavor. A pound of coffee mixed with chicory lasted twice as long, cutting caffeine expenses in half without eliminating the morning ritual families treasured. The chicory itself could be grown in gardens or foraged from roadsides where the blue-flowered plants grew wild. Children who grew up drinking chicory coffee often found pure coffee thin and unsatisfying by comparison. This simple substitution saved money monthly while creating a distinctive regional taste that became cultural identity rather than poverty marker. Saving and replanting seeds from the best garden plants meant never buying seeds again while developing varieties perfectly adapted to local growing conditions over generations. Families selected seeds from their healthiest, most productive plants, drying and storing them for next year's garden. These saved seeds carried genetics refined through years of selection, often outperforming commercial varieties bred for shipping rather than taste or local adaptation. The practice required knowledge of which plants bred true and which would cross-pollinate, but this knowledge passed through families like any other essential skill. A well-maintained seed collection represented decades of genetic refinement worth far more than its negligible cost. Children learned to identify the best plants for seed saving, understanding that next year's garden depended on this year's careful selection. Seed saving embodied mountain self-sufficiency, proving that even the smallest inputs could be eliminated through knowledge and planning. Making vinegar from apple scraps turned kitchen waste into valuable preserving acid and salad dressing base that would otherwise require store purchase. Apple peels and cores were covered with water in crocks, left to ferment for weeks until alcohol formed, then exposed to air until bacteria converted the alcohol to acetic acid. The resulting vinegar worked perfectly for pickling, salad dressings, cleaning, and any other use requiring acid. Families who made their own vinegar never bought it from stores, saving money while using scraps that would otherwise become compost at best. The fermentation process required patience but no special equipment beyond a crock and cheesecloth cover. Children watched the transformation with fascination, learning that even garbage held potential value. Homemade vinegar often tasted more complex than commercial versions, with apple undertones that enhanced pickles and dressings. This practice exemplified the mountain philosophy that nothing should be wasted when transformation was possible. Cooking one-pot meals that used every bit of fuel efficiently meant families could eat well while burning less wood or using less propane than multiple-dish cooking required. Stews, soups, and casseroles combined proteins, vegetables, and starches in single vessels that simmered slowly while requiring minimal attention and fuel. These meals often tasted better than separately cooked components because flavors melded during long cooking, creating complexity that quick methods couldn't achieve. Families planned meals around fuel efficiency, understanding that heating the stove cost money whether cooking one dish or five. A properly planned one-pot meal provided complete nutrition with minimal resource expenditure. Children grew up eating these combined dishes, never knowing that separate meat and vegetable plates were considered normal elsewhere. The practice saved both money and labor while producing genuinely delicious food that modern slow cooker enthusiasts have rediscovered. Pickling vegetables in summer preserved garden abundance for winter eating without the equipment expense or fuel costs that pressure canning required for low-acid foods. Cucumbers, beans, peppers, and other vegetables were packed into jars with vinegar brine that preserved them safely at room temperature through simple water bath processing. The vinegar's acidity prevented bacterial growth, making pickling one of the safest and easiest preservation methods available. A summer afternoon of pickling could fill dozens of jars that would provide vegetables through the entire winter, turning seasonal glut into year-round availability. The pickled vegetables added variety and nutrition to winter diets, dominated by dried beans and preserved meats. Children helped pack jars and pour brine, learning preservation skills they would use throughout their lives. Pickling required minimal investment yet returned maximum food security, making it essential knowledge for families who couldn't afford to buy vegetables year-round. Trading labor for food with neighbors created informal economies where skills and time substituted for money that rural families often lacked in sufficient quantities. A family might help a neighbor butcher hogs in exchange for meat, or assist with harvest in exchange for a share of the crop. These arrangements built community, while ensuring families with more time than money could still eat well. The practice required trust and fair dealing, with reputations built over years of reliable exchanges. Children learned that labor held real value that could be traded as readily as cash, a lesson that served them throughout lives where money wasn't always available. Labor trading meant that even families without gardens could access fresh produce through helping those who grew it. The system created resilience that pure cash economies lacked, with neighbors supporting each other through difficult times because relationships mattered more than transactions. Making soup from ham bones extracted every bit of value from expensive meat purchases and produced rich broth that elevated simple meals to something memorable. After the meat was eaten, bones went into pots with water, vegetables, and seasonings, simmering for hours until the broth turned golden and rich with dissolved collagen and flavor. This broth became the base for bean soups, vegetable soups, and cooking liquid for rice and grains that absorbed the smoky pork essence. A single ham bone could produce gallons of broth, extending the value of the original meat purchase across multiple additional meals. Families understood that bones held nearly as much value as meat when properly used, making ham purchases effectively cheaper than they appeared. Children grew up knowing that cooking wasn't finished until bones had given up their last nutrients. This practice meant nothing from expensive meat purchases went to waste. Growing potatoes in any available space provided more calories per square foot than almost any other crop, making them essential for families trying to maximize food production from limited garden areas. Potatoes grew in traditional rows, in stacked tires, in straw mulch, and even in bags of soil on porches where yard space didn't exist. A single seed potato could produce 10 pounds or more of food, multiplication rates that no other staple could match. Stored properly in cool, dark root cellars, potatoes lasted through winter and into spring, providing reliable starch when other fresh vegetables were unavailable. Families planted multiple varieties to spread harvest across seasons and reduce disease risk that could devastate single-variety plantings. Children helped with planting, hilling, and harvest, learning that this humble vegetable could mean the difference between hunger and satisfaction. Potatoes represented food security in its most fundamental form, accessible to anyone with minimal space and basic knowledge. Cane syrup pie was a dessert deeply rooted in Southern sugar heritage, reflecting both thrift and sweetness. Made by blending cane syrup with eggs, butter, and a simple crust, it created a pie that was rich yet affordable. For families, it was an accessible treat when refined sugar was too costly or scarce. The deep, molasses-like flavor of cane syrup gave it a distinct taste that stood apart from other pies. Children eagerly anticipated slices at Sunday dinners or holidays, associating it with comfort and celebration. Adults valued it for how it stretched inexpensive pantry staples into something that felt indulgent. Cane syrup pie also carried cultural weight, tying households to the sugarcane fields that defined much of the Southern economy. Today, it is rarely baked, its bold flavor and simplicity overshadowed by modern desserts. Forgotten in most kitchens, it remains a reminder of Southern resilience. Cane syrup pie was more than a sweet ending. It was a testament to resourcefulness. Cornmeal mush with drippings was the ultimate proof that Appalachian cooks could turn yesterday's leftovers into today's comfort. First, you stirred cornmeal into salted water until it thickened into a firm porridge, poured it into pans, and let it cool overnight. The next morning, those firm slabs were sliced and fried in hot bacon grease until the edges crisped brown and the centers stayed creamy and soft. The smell alone was enough to pull folks from their beds, as rich and tempting as any feast. Poured over with white gravy or syrup, it became a breakfast fit for a hard day's work. Families who had little knew how to stretch every grain, every drop of grease, and every bit of effort. The crackle from the skillet told them they had done it right. Cornmeal mush with drippings was more than a meal. It was a quiet triumph. It fed the body and reminded the heart that nothing had gone to waste. Each bite tasted like patience, creativity, and pride, the kind only born from making do. What began as simple porridge became a golden slice of home that fed generations through thick and thin. Wild greens mess with ham hock was Christmas side that brought spring preservation to winter table. In spring, mountain families gathered wild greens, poke, lamb's quarters, dandelion, and canned them for winter. By Christmas, these jars represented summer work and wild food knowledge. The greens were cooked long and slow with smoked ham hock until tender and richly flavored. The pot liquor was savory and nourishing, meant to be sopped up with cornbread. In Appalachian communities, wild greens meant Christmas connection to land and seasons. Proving celebration included foods gathered free from hillsides. The greens were slightly bitter, balanced by ham's saltiness and smokiness. This was nutrition and tradition combined, teaching children that Christmas abundance came from knowing land and being willing to work hard, preserving what nature provided freely to those with knowledge and respect. Sourwood honey pone delivered the essence of Appalachian mountain summers in a simple yet unforgettable corn cake. Grandmothers blended fresh ground cornmeal with buttermilk and farm eggs, then stirred in a generous drizzle of rare sourwood honey gathered from high mountain hives. Baked in a cast iron skillet, The pone emerged with a golden crust and a moist crumb sweetened with the floral, slightly tangy notes of the honey. Families prize this treat because sourwood blooms for only a short season, making the honey a cherished ingredient that neighbors often traded like gold. Served warm with fresh butter, each slice carried the fragrance of mountain flowers and the warmth of hearth and home. Children savored every bite, aware that the next taste might be a year away. Sourwood honey pone remains a beloved memory of the Appalachian Hills, where natural bounty and careful timing combined to create a dish that was as fleeting as it was delicious. Wild turkey roasted with chestnut dressing was Christmas dinner that required hunting success and forest knowledge. These weren't farm turkeys, but wild birds shot in December woods, their meat darker and more flavorful than domestic fowl. The turkey was stuffed with dressing made from dried cornbread, wild chestnuts gathered in fall, sage, and onions. Roasted slowly, the bird developed crispy skin while staying moist inside, the chestnut dressing absorbing juices and becoming rich and savory. In mountain communities, wild turkey represented Christmas success. The hunter who brought one home provided real celebration. The meat was lean and slightly gamey, requiring careful cooking to stay tender. Chestnuts added sweetness and texture impossible with modern ingredients. This was Christmas earned through December mornings in cold woods, through knowing turkey habits and shooting straight. The finished bird fed extended family, its presence on the table marking genuine achievement. Cornbread and milk supper was what families ate when the pantry was nearly bare. A leftover wedge of cornbread crumbled into a bowl, covered with cold milk or tangy buttermilk, became dinner without complaint. It was cool and soft, with just enough salt and sweetness to feel like comfort. Hill folk did not see this as poor eating. They saw it as good sense. Every crumb mattered. Every drop of milk earned its keep. On hot summer nights, this meal kept folks full without firing up the stove again. It carried the quiet rhythm of old kitchens, simple, clean, and made from what you had. Some would drizzle a little molasses over top or sprinkle sugar if they had extra. Kids slurped it down, while elders remembered the hard times that taught them gratitude. Cornbread and milk supper was proof that even in scarcity, there was dignity, taste, and the kind of peace that only home-cooked food could bring. Venison stew with root vegetables was the essence of frontier survival, a slow-simmered meal that turned wild game into pure comfort. Hunters dressed the deer with practiced skill, saving every cut of meat for the long winter nights ahead. Thick pieces of venison browned in a cast-iron pot before joining chunks of potatoes, turnips, and carrots gathered from sparse gardens or traded from nearby homesteads. A splash of creek water and a handful of dried herbs created a broth that grew richer with every hour beside the fire. The stew cooked until the meat fell apart and the vegetables softened into a silky base that warmed chilled bones after a day in the cold. Families gathered with tin cups and rough bread, savoring each bite while the wind howled beyond the cabin walls. This simple dish brought hunters and children alike around the same pot, proving that careful effort and patience could turn a lean harvest into a feast. Today, few know the deep flavor of true venison cooked with such quiet attention. Batter-fried eggplant rounds were a Depression-era side dish that turned vegetables into something hearty and satisfying. Sliced eggplant was dipped in batter or cornmeal and fried until crisp, creating a dish that could stand in for meat when money was scarce. Families loved its rich texture and flavor, which made simple suppers feel fuller. It became a thrifty way to transform garden harvests into something indulgent. For children, it offered a crunchy treat that made vegetables exciting, while adults appreciated its practicality. The dish reflected how Southern cooks elevated humble crops into meals that carried dignity and satisfaction. It was often served with simple sauces or alongside beans and bread, filling out a plate with ease. Today, fried eggplant has mostly disappeared from everyday kitchens, replaced by quicker or processed sides. Its fading popularity speaks to the loss of seasonal cooking tied directly to gardens. Batter-fried eggplant rounds remain a reminder of resilience and creativity born out of hard times. Cured gizzard confit transformed a humble poultry part into a delicacy through slow, deliberate cooking that celebrated thrift and flavor. Grandmothers cleaned the gizzards carefully, seasoning them with salt, pepper, and garden herbs before submerging them in rendered fat from the same bird. Over hours of gentle heat, the tough muscle relaxed into silky tenderness while absorbing every note of seasoning. Once cooled, the gizzards were stored in their own fat, ready to be crisped in a hot skillet or served cold with pickled vegetables. This method ensured nothing from the chicken went to waste and provided a ready source of protein through busy weeks. Guests were often surprised by the rich taste that rivaled more expensive cuts of meat, proving that economy and elegance could share the same plate. Cured gizzard confit stands as a testament to the Southern grandmother's ability to elevate the simplest ingredients into something extraordinary with patience, care, and a deep respect for the whole bird that nourished the family table. Stack cake with dried apple filling was Christmas dessert requiring community cooperation and weeks of preparation. This wasn't ordinary cake, but thin layers stacked with dried apple filling, creating towering centerpiece feeding dozens. Women began drying apples in late summer, slicing thin and laying on screens until leathery. Come Christmas, apples were rehydrated and cooked with molasses and cinnamon until thick. The cake layers were simple: flour, lard, molasses, spices, rolled thin and baked separately. Assembly was ceremony, each layer placed and spread with apple mixture. The cake sat for days, letting flavors meld into something slicing clean and tasting like autumn. In mountain communities, stack cake represented cooperation because neighbors often brought layers to celebrations. The finished cake stood tall, dark layers visible through golden apple filling. This represented mountain Christmas, patient, cooperative, deeply satisfying. Rabbit and dumplings was a meal that tasted like effort and reward mixed together, the kind that carried the story of the hunt straight to the supper table. Catching the rabbit was only half the work. The rest was done slow and steady in the kitchen. The meat was browned, simmered in broth until tender, and dropped into bubbling stock where floury dumplings waited to soak up every drop of flavor. Steam fogged the windows while the smell drifted through the house, wrapping around everyone like a promise of comfort. It was gamey, rich, and deeply satisfying, an old-world supper that turned survival into celebration. Every bite reminded folks that food earned by hand carried a different kind of pride. Families would sit quiet except for the clink of spoons and soft hums of contentment. Rabbit and dumplings filled bellies and hearts alike, warming even the coldest nights. It was country comfort at its finest, built from grit, gratitude, and a little wild luck. In mountain homes, it stood as proof that patience and hard work always paid off. The meal may have been humble, but the feeling it brought was priceless: home, warmth, and a kind of joy you could only taste. Smoked venison. Jerky ensured that nothing from a successful hunt went to waste and that meat would last through the long frozen months. Lean deer strips were salted generously and hung above a low smoldering fire for hours, sometimes days, until the smoke kissed every fiber and the moisture vanished. The process demanded patience and constant tending to keep the temperature steady without open flames. The result was a dark, chewy strip packed with protein and smoky depth that could be eaten on the trail without any preparation. Hunters and trappers stored the jerky in cloth bags or metal tins, confident it would keep through weeks of travel. Children gnawed on pieces like candy, and adults often crumbled bits into stews for an extra layer of flavor. Even today, jerky remains popular, but few modern versions capture the true wilderness taste of venison, slowly dried over real wood smoke while wind rustled through the trees and snow crept along the ground outside the camp. Cracklin cornbread was once the pride of farmhouse kitchens, combining the richness of pork with the staple of cornmeal. Cracklings, or crispy bits of pork skin and fat, were folded into cornbread batter before baking. The result was a savory, hearty bread with bursts of crunch and flavor in every bite. For families, it was a way to stretch pork trimmings and ensure nothing went to waste. Served hot from cast iron pans, it paired perfectly with beans, greens, or stews, rounding out meals with rustic comfort. Children grew up associating its smell with warmth and family dinners. Cracklin cornbread carried cultural weight, embodying thrift and creativity in rural kitchens. Today, plain cornbread dominates, leaving the Cracklin version nearly forgotten except in certain regions. Its decline reflects broader changes in diets and preferences, as pork fat gave way to lighter cooking. Still, it remains a powerful reminder of how Southern cooks celebrated resourcefulness. Cracklin cornbread was never just bread, it was heritage in every crumb. Sheep sorrel spring soup welcomed the first bright greens of the year with a flavor that was tart and refreshing after the heavy meals of winter. Southern grandmothers gathered tender sorrel leaves from meadows and fence lines just as church bells finished ringing on early spring Sundays. The lemony taste of the wild plants needed little more than a simmer in light chicken broth with onions and a splash of fresh cream to create a soup that sparkled with natural freshness. Children often joined in the hunt for the soft green leaves, learning to recognize the arrow-shaped plants among the grasses. The soup's gentle tang awakened palates that had grown accustomed to preserved vegetables and root cellars during cold months. Families savored each spoonful, knowing that the short season would pass quickly and the tender sorrel would soon grow tough under the stronger sun. Sheep sorrel spring soup remains a lively reminder of the importance of foraging knowledge and the simple joy of gathering food directly from the earth at the very start of a southern spring. Leather britches with fatback brought summer's green beans to Christmas through ancient preservation. These weren't canned beans, but fresh beans strung on thread in late summer and hung from rafters. By Christmas, they hung brown, rattling when touched. The beans were soaked overnight, then cooked slowly with fatback until tender. The result tasted like concentrated summer with smoky richness. In Appalachian homes, leather britches represented connection between seasons, August abundance preserved for December. Grandmothers taught granddaughters proper stringing, threading beans carefully for drying. The beans hung all fall, visible reminders of summer work feeding Christmas tables. Cooked long, they became tender with chewy texture unlike fresh beans. The pot liquor was rich, sopped with cornbread. This represented mountain resourcefulness, preserving without equipment, feeding families through winter using thread and time. Corn fritters with sorghum syrup were the kind of treat that made even the hardest days end on a sweet note. Fresh corn was grated right off the cob, mixed with egg and cornmeal, then dropped into hot grease until puffed and golden. Each fritter sizzled with that unmistakable sound of something good cooking. You could eat them plain with a pinch of salt, or drizzle them with dark, sticky sorghum syrup for a dessert that tasted like sunshine and soil. The syrup itself was a treasure, boiled down slow from cane juice, thick as honey and twice as rich. It was poured with care because every drop was earned through long days of turning the mill. Corn fritters were a fair reward for that labor, shared hot from the pan between laughter and stories. Their crisp edges and soft centers made them perfect for breakfast or supper alike. It was the kind of food that did not need a recipe, just memory and feeling, passed down from one careful cook to another. Simple, honest, and always satisfying. Forager's mushroom. Ragu transformed a handful of wild mushrooms into a meal that tasted of deep forest soil and clean rain. Hunters gathered chanterelles, morels, or other seasonal finds at first light, brushing off pine needles and slicing them into rustic pieces. In a heavy skillet, they melted bacon fat with garlic and wild onions until the fragrance filled the clearing, then tossed in the mushrooms to sear and release their earthy juices. A splash of spring water or a spoon of cream, if available, created a silky sauce that clung to each tender bite. Served over bread or with a side of roasted roots, the ragu delivered warmth and rich umami to those who spent their days in silence among towering trees. This dish celebrated knowledge of the land, for it required careful identification and respect for nature's offerings. Modern cooks may buy farmed mushrooms year-round, but they cannot capture the sense of discovery and quiet reward that came from gathering a meal straight from the shadowed floor of the wilderness. Sorrel drink was a festive, tart beverage once served in southern homes, carrying deep Caribbean influence. Made from dried hibiscus flowers steeped with spices, sugar, and citrus, it was a bright red drink with bold flavor. Families often prepared it for holidays or special gatherings where its tangy taste stood out from other sweet beverages. Sorrel was cherished not only for its refreshing qualities, but also for its ties to heritage and celebration. It reflected the blending of Caribbean and Southern traditions, especially within African American communities. Children enjoyed it chilled on hot days, while adults valued its cultural symbolism and unique taste. For many households, Sorrel drink marked special occasions with color and joy. Over time, it faded as sodas and commercial juices became common, overshadowing its handmade appeal. Today, it is mostly remembered in cultural festivals or passed down through family recipes. Sorrel drink remains a symbol of identity and resilience, showing how global traditions shaped Southern kitchens. Rabbit gravy over rice was Christmas dinner that stretched small game into meal feeding many. The rabbits were jointed and browned, then simmered until tender in broth thickened with flour into rich gravy. Served over white rice, this created complete meal that was economical and deeply satisfying. In mountain communities, rabbit gravy represented resourcefulness, turning 2 or 3 small rabbits into dinner for 10 or more people. The gravy was savory and rich, flavored with wild onions and black pepper. Rice stretched the meal further, soaking up every drop of gravy while providing filling carbohydrates. This was Christmas dinner born from necessity but elevated through care and proper technique. The rabbit meat was tender and mild, the gravy thick and comforting. Families gathered around steaming bowls, understanding that celebration came from making the most of what you had, transforming scarcity into sufficiency through skill and tradition passed through generations of mountain cooks. Ramps and eggs were spring's homecoming song in the hills. Ramps, those wild mountain onions with a kick sharp enough to make your eyes water, came up when winter loosened its grip. Folks foraged them along shady slopes, carrying bunches home like treasure. Fried in bacon grease, they turned golden and fragrant, and when you cracked eggs over them, the skillet became a celebration of survival. After months of salted meats and dried beans, this meal tasted alive again. The air filled with that pungent scent only mountain people could love. It was quick to make, rich in flavor, and a sure sign that better weather had arrived. Ramps and eggs reminded everyone that the land still provided if you knew where to look. That first bite after the thaw was like breathing again, spicy, hearty, and filled with gratitude for another season of life in the Appalachian Hills. Buffalo tongue stew was once considered a delicacy of the plains, offering rich texture and surprising tenderness that rewarded those willing to use every part of the animal. After a successful hunt, hunters cleaned the tongue carefully and simmered it for hours with onions, carrots, and a handful of wild herbs until the meat turned soft and silky. The broth thickened naturally, creating a savory base that clung to chunks of potato or cornbread dunked at the table. Around campfires or in frontier cabins, the stew became both celebration and sustenance, honoring the animal that provided so much. Children listened wide-eyed to stories of the chase while the fragrant steam carried through the crisp night air. This dish reflected a deep respect for nature's gifts and the understanding that waste was not an option. Today, buffalo herds have returned, but few cooks attempt the careful preparation of tongue, leaving this once-cherished meal largely forgotten except in the memories of those who knew its unique richness. Boiled custard was once a cherished stovetop dessert drink, especially popular at Christmas before eggnog dominated. Made by gently cooking milk, eggs, sugar, and vanilla until thickened, it was served chilled in cups or poured over cakes. Families saw it as a holiday luxury, simple yet elegant. Children loved its creamy sweetness, often sneaking extra sips when no one was watching. Adults valued it as a celebratory tradition that required care and patience to prepare. Boiled custard represented comfort and indulgence in an era when ingredients were scarce, showing how much joy could come from basics. At gatherings, it was poured into punch bowls or shared from pitchers, bringing people together. Its place at Christmas tables gave it special meaning, tied to memory and festivity. Today, it is nearly forgotten, with eggnog taking over as the seasonal favorite. Its decline speaks to changing tastes and the fading of handmade holiday traditions. Boiled custard remains a forgotten gem, one sip carrying the warmth of Southern celebrations. Blackberry jam cake was Christmas dessert, carrying summer's wild harvest into winter celebration. This wasn't ordinary cake, but dense creation, darkened with blackberry jam stirred into batter. The jam came from wild berries picked along fence rows in July, cooked with sugar and preserved. Come Christmas, jam transformed into cake moisture and flavor, tart, sweet, purple. The batter was spiced with cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, creating warmth, complementing berry brightness. Baked in cast iron, the cake emerged dark and fragrant, its crumb tight from jam. Some families added caramel icing, others served plain. In mountain communities, blackberry jam cake represented foresight and connection to land, picking berries in summer for Christmas months away. Children remembered helping pick berries, fingers stained purple. Understanding this work would become December dessert. The cake sliced thick, each piece carrying memories of summer foraging. Chicken and slick dumplings were the mountain way of turning one bird into a feast that fed everyone around the table. A single chicken simmered down into a rich broth that filled the house with the smell of Sunday comfort. Thin dumplings rolled by hand replaced fancy noodles, soaking up every drop of flavor and thickening the stew into a creamy, heartwarming dish. The bits of tender chicken floated among the slick dumplings like treasure pieces in gravy. This was not a meal of plenty, but one of patience, pride, and clever hands. Appalachian cooks knew how to stretch what they had until it felt like abundance. Steam rose from the pot like a promise that no one would go hungry tonight. Every bowl felt earned, heavy, and satisfying in the way only home cooking can be. The leftovers, if any, tasted richer by morning. Chicken and slick dumplings turned scarcity into celebration, hardship into comfort, and hunger into harmony. It was food for body and soul alike. Even today, that first spoonful carries the same truth. It does not take much to make a meal worth remembering when it is made with care and love. Campfire Dutch oven. Peach cobbler turned rugged campsites into places of sweet reward after days of hard labor. Hunters or homesteaders opened precious cans of peaches saved from summer and poured them into a cast iron pot, topping them with biscuit dough mixed on the spot. The lid was covered with glowing coals, and the cobbler baked slowly as night settled over the mountains. The scent of fruit and butter rose into the cool air, drawing every tired traveler toward the fire. When the lid lifted, golden crust revealed bubbling peach syrup that dripped onto tin plates. This dessert was more than a treat. It was proof that even in the wilds, a taste of comfort and celebration was possible. Children scraped the pot clean while adults savored the rare sweetness, knowing the peaches might be the only fruit for weeks. Modern camping desserts cannot match the simple magic of cobbler baked under stars with nothing but iron, fire, and patience to guide it. Dried apple stack pie was Christmas dessert requiring year-round work and patient assembly. Unlike stack cake with filling between layers, this pie layered thin pastry with reconstituted dried apples, building height through repetition. Each layer was seasoned with cinnamon and sugar before the next went on. Baked slowly, the pie emerged golden with visible apple layers throughout. In Appalachian communities, dried apple stack pie represented Christmas tradition connecting summer work to winter celebration. The apples had to be dried in August, stored properly through fall, then carefully rehydrated for Christmas baking. The result was concentrated apple flavor in every bite, proof that patience created the best results. This was mountain Christmas at its finest, taking what summer provided, preserving it through fall, and transforming it into winter celebration that tasted like all three seasons, combined into one magnificent pie feeding dozens and creating memories lasting lifetimes. Possum and sweet potatoes was the kind of backwoods dinner that kept families fed through the leanest winters. When hunting was luck and store meat was too dear, possum became fair game, slow roasted in the hearth until tender and rich. Paired with syrupy baked sweet potatoes, the dish filled the kitchen with a deep, smoky aroma that wrapped around every soul inside. The meat's wild flavor was softened by the caramel sweetness of the potatoes, balancing the meal just right. No one cooked it for show. It was made from necessity and served with pride. In those hills, feeding your family meant using what the woods offered, without apology or waste. Preparing it took skill, patience, and courage, the kind born from survival, not luxury. Each bite carried the taste of the land, wild and honest as the people who cooked it. For visitors, it was daring. For locals, it was life. Possum and sweet potatoes told the story of mountain living, rough, resourceful, and full of heart. It was food that asked nothing fancy, only respect for what was given and gratitude for what it provided. Which money-saving trick would keep your family fed? Drop your favorites in the comments, hit the like button, and subscribe for more forgotten wisdom from the hills.